Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. This is Sociology 126, Health of the Public. Let me just make a couple of announcements. First and most importantly, we've been successful in recruiting more TFs and persuading the registrar so we can now expand sections. And since sections happen to be required for this class, that means we can continue to enroll more students. As I mentioned the last time, it's my firm philosophy that Yale students classes should not be capped, with very rare exceptions. And I just didn't want to be forced to do that. So you're all welcome to enroll, and we've expanded the number of sections, and they're now available online for enrollment. And we will continue to try to meet any student demand to the extent that Yale College allows us to. Also, there are a few high school students from New Haven that we allow such students to take the class, and they are welcome as well. We had sent out an email expressing some concern. I've since heard that it's ambiguous whether those high school students need to take section or not, and Maggie Traeger, the head TF, will close the loop with you on that. There's Maggie. I want to introduce her. Ordinarily, if we were in person, she would come up on stage. Maggie, would you like to say hello to people?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name here says Margaret, but feel free to call me Maggie. I am a sixth-year PhD student in the sociology department. I work in Nicholas's lab studying health and networks and space and neighborhoods, a number of different things, including a side project in robotics. So if you're interested in talking about this class or science or doing a PhD or public health generally, the logistics for this class, feel free to come talk to me.
Maggie is terrific, and I'm very fortunate to have her in the lab, and very fortunate to have been teaching this course with her for a couple of years now. So sectioning is open. We're going to be, of course, videotaping and podcasting these classes. Slides will be made available at the end of every week for all the slides of the preceding week. We are allowing asynchronous enrollment in this class. However, if you take asynchronous enrollment or if you're choosing to watch some of the videos because of time zone issues or whatever, the one exception is that you have to show up for the in-person exams when they're offered. There's one exam on a Tuesday and one exam on a Thursday. So if you have a conflict with the other class has to bear that burden on that particular day that we're offering an exam. And I'm also going to be tweeting about the class periodically. And when I do, I'll typically tag hash mark Socy 126. And if you're curious, you can go back years and see other types of stuff that's been tagged with that hash mark. I want to stress that this class is very broadly synthetic of the social sciences and medicine, and that it has both quantitative and qualitative materials in it, and that it occasionally involves allusions to biological phenomena or mathematical concepts or medical concepts, and some basic math and so on. But much of this stuff is at the beginning of the class, and I have no doubt that you can handle it. So none of you should be intimidated by any of the biology or very basic math that sometimes comes up in the class. And as I said, knowledge of biology and math is not essential for the course, and I'll gladly answer questions about things as they come up if they don't make sense. Maggie and I are still working out the best way to handle questions given the reality of online Zooming and the fact that when I'm speaking to you right now, I can't see you. Like I can only see like 6 of you or 8 of you, and which is very awkward for me. But I think what we may do is I may pause a couple of times a lecture, maybe not the first couple of lectures, and then you can either add comments to the chat or raise your hands. And I think if you raise your hands, you'll appear on my screen, and we'll try to handle questions. It's a very important part of my belief in the proper pedagogic practice that even in lectures, students participate, raise hands, and talk. And Zoom, unfortunately, has made it difficult for me to enact that commitment. So last week, we discussed a number of things. Using suicide as an initial example, we contrasted the personal and collective ways of studying illness, medicine, and death. And we talked about different ways more generally of understanding social phenomena. For example, we spoke about this issue of methodologic individualism versus methodological holism. And we described the ways that the practice of medicine differs from the practice of public health. We saw practically that human lifespans have increased dramatically in the last century, at least in the United States, from an average life expectancy at birth for women of 46 years to over 80 years in the past century. And this was, in fact, an amazing achievement unmatched in human history. a historic rise in human well-being. And as an aside, you only get to do that once, right? We only get to increase life expectancy to 80 years once. We don't get to do it a second time, and it's already been done. However, we also took a big step back recently, as we saw, and we'll return to this topic with COVID-19, which has put a big crimp in human life expectancy. And we introduced the social patterning of longevity and causes of death. We saw very briefly, opening lecture, that how long you live and what you die of appears to vary not only across time, but also across socioeconomic attributes. And we introduced some phenomena that we'll be considering in this class, such as neighborhoods, institutions, and networks, and how these things may affect people's longevity, health, and mortality. Now, in this class, we're going to be engaging the implications of structural opportunities for individuals. And this is actually a long-standing debate in the social sciences. Does your fate depend on your own choices and actions, or does your fate depend on the choices and actions of others, or the structural factors that surround you? And this is the tension between structure and agency that is a crucial topic in this class. And of course, both are important, but the extent to which each is important in any particular outcome is often contested philosophically, theoretically, empirically, morally, and pragmatically. So in the case of health, the questions become quite important. What determines health? Is it individuals or the environment? And who's responsible? And these questions in turn raise obvious moral and policy implications and agendas. And behind these questions is the question of whether medical care really makes any difference at all. If your fate is determined, for example, by social factors, whether those are individual or collective, maybe there's very little that medicine can do. Consider this, for example. The United States spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world, but it does not have the best outcomes. For example, in 2016, we spent an average of $9,403 per person, and the United Kingdom spent $3,377 per person, less than half as much. But people in the United Kingdom live longer and have fewer medical problems than we do, even accounting for age and race. Now, just to give you a feel for the sort of outlier the United States is, take a look at this graph. And one of these is not like the others. The United States and the United Kingdom have roughly the same as indicated. Here's the United States, and here's Great Britain. They have roughly the same life expectancy. So here on the x-axis is the health spending per capita. I'm sorry, when I'm talking to you, I look to my left, which is where my slides are. So if I were lecturing to you, it would be as if I was on the right-hand side of an amphitheater, and I'd be looking up to my left. So just imagine I'm doing that. So here on the left, on my left, is the healthcare spending per capita on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the life expectancy in years. So here's the United States that I hope you're seeing as I move my pointer, and here's Great Britain. They have a similar life expectancy, although the United States is spending so much more per capita than Great Britain. So they have roughly the same life expectancy, but very different levels of spending. Oops. And here's Japan. I'm now just learning that actually the animations don't work when I'm in presenter mode on Zoom. So that's something I'm going to have to figure out. And here's Japan. And if you look at Japan, Japan has similar spending as England, but even greater life expectancy than the United Kingdom. So understanding and explaining some of these differences will be one of the objectives of this course. Now, one of the arguments we'll be making is that while biomedical care might be effective in acute and inpatient settings, in chronic diseases and outpatient settings, it's much less effective. Thus, a focus on access to healthcare ignores the most important determinants of health, the patient's sociocultural context. And this in turn can lead to misguided policies. In fact, in order to improve the health of a population, In my view, physicians must serve as advocates for improved social conditions, public health initiatives, general and health education, and behavioral interventions. Now, one argument to explain the American healthcare paradox of why we are spending more but getting less is this. As shown, we spend by far the most when one looks just at healthcare. So here are all the countries on the x-axis. On the y-axis is per capita spending. Here's the United States. We spend far more than any other country. Here's Japan, which spends less than half that we do. But a possible resolution of this paradox is that other countries spend more on social supports in addition to healthcare. For example, in OECD countries as a whole, for every $1 spent on healthcare, they spend $2 on social services. But in the United States, for $1 spent on healthcare, we only spend about 55 cents on social services. So total spending on health and social support is actually higher in those other countries. So it's not healthcare spending that can really buy us health, perhaps. So if you look here, for example, before we said that the United States, the blue line, total health expenditures, the blue line is higher than anyone else. But then after the blue line, we don't spend so much on total social service expenditures. But if you look at other countries, they eclipse us in total spending. So this is maybe a clue that what really matters for health is not what you spend on healthcare, but rather what you spend more generally to provide a safety net, for example, a social safety net and other social supports in your society. And this may help explain the paradox that I introduced a couple of slides ago of the mismatch between spending on healthcare and the health outcomes that are observed. Now, as we introduced at the last lecture, life expectancy has changed a lot in the past century. On the x-axis is time from 1900 to 2010. On the y-axis is life expectancy. Women are shown in red, men are shown in yellow, and the dotted lines are your life expectancy if you reach the age of 65. The solid lines are at birth. So, we saw last time, about 100 years ago, women at birth could expect to live 48 years on average, and that has gone up steadily to about 80 years over the last century, which is astonishing. Similar for men, men live less long than women. Men are disadvantaged compared to women when it comes to this very important outcome. They're not advantaged. And their improvements in the last 100 years have not been as great as those seen in women. If you look at life expectancy at age 65, if you survived early childhood back then and you made it to 65, you might expect to live 12 years. And now, 100 years later, you might expect to live 20 years if you're a woman, some lower number of years if you're a man. The gain in life expectancy at advanced stages is lower because the real bang we've gotten in the last year has been the conquest of early childhood diseases, which, again, as I said, we only get to do once. We only get, as a species, to stop babies from dying once. And we've done that in the past century. Now, in fact, US life expectancy has increased for most of the past 60 years, but the rate at which this increase has been observed has slowed over time. And in fact, since 2014, even before the coronavirus pandemic, life expectancy in our society had been declining a little bit. Things have been getting worse in terms of how long Americans might expect to live. And there have been a number of important contributors to this. One, for example, has been drug overdoses, or suicides, or diseases related to the obesity epidemic. As we'll discuss later in the course, Americans are getting fatter and fatter. And this is beginning to shorten our lives at the population level. So there are all of these things that are happening in our society, which maybe work against some of the positive things that we have seen. And this increase in mortality is seen especially in young and middle-aged adults of all racial groups, with an onset as early as the 1990s, and with the largest relative increase occurring in the Ohio Valley and in New England. So certain parts of the country in certain age groups are seeing rises in certain causes of death. And as a result of that, overall life expectancy at birth in the United States has been declining, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as I talked about last time, and as I'll return to in a few lectures, has caused a precipitous drop in life expectancy in our society. Nevertheless, this increase in life expectancy or decreases in mortality is actually part of a larger phenomenon known as the health transition. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to frame, I've just shown you the last 100 years. I've said life expectancy is increasing in our society. How can we understand this change? Well, it turns out it's part of a macro social change that typically occurs over many decades or centuries in any given society. And it's part of what's known as the health transition, which was described first by a epidemiologist by the name of Abdel Amran in 1971 in your readings. Let's see if we can understand what that means. So in order to really understand what's happening in terms of human life expectancy at birth, we need a certain kind of data that goes quite significantly back in time. And the conventional perspective on this phenomenon, known as the health transition, is that there are 4 stages to it, and it relates to the socioeconomic development and disease patterns seen in any population. This slide shows on the x-axis some arbitrary amount of time. It could be 100 years, it could be 500 years. Time is on the x-axis, or even 50 years it could be in some countries. And on the y-axis are a few indicators, the CBR, the crude birth rate, the CDR, the crude death rate, and which are shown in blue is the crude birth rate. And right here, let me see if I can get my thing to work. The crude birth rate is in blue, which is this line here. The crude death rate is in red, which is this line. And the total population is shown in the black line. So here is the first stage of the health transition, which is the so-called pre-modern stage. And I'm going to describe these 4 stages in terms of a typical fully developed country today, such as the United States or Canada, or the countries of Europe, or similar societies elsewhere like Japan or Australia. And the time scale, as I said, could be 50 to 400 years. So stage 1 is the pre-modern stage. And it's characterized by high rates of birth and high rates of death, both of which are relatively steady across time and relatively balanced. And as a result of that, population stays relatively constant. For thousands of years in the life of our species, the global population didn't change very much at all. Birth rates and death rates were very high, around 30 to 50 per thousand, and their approximate balance resulted in only very slow population growth. Over much of prehistory, at least since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, population growth was so low that it was less than 0.05% per year, meaning that population doubled only once every 1,000 to 5,000 years. It took thousands of years for the population to double, given in pre-modern times. And this is known as the high stationary stage of population growth, high birth and death rates and stationary rates in terms of both of them and population numbers. Now, death rates were very high at all times during this stage for a number of reasons, including lack of knowledge, lack of accurate knowledge about disease prevention, famines, people died of famine, and the impact of extrinsic causes on people's mortality. Why did our ancestors die? They died from accidents, they died from infections, they died from, well, not really predation in the time frame we're talking about, but other things killed them outside their bodies, often when they were very young. So if you look here, up here in a kind of summary of the pre-modern phase, socioeconomic development, not so great. You know, you're getting, you know, maybe into the Roman Empire or something like that. Life expectancy at birth is low. It's about 30. You could expect to live about 30 years on average. And the diseases were acute, infectious, and nutritional diseases. You died from hunger or infections, and so on. But then at some point, stage 2 begins, when societies begin to urbanize or industrialize. And then something very interesting seems to happen. There's a rise in population right here. Population rises because the death rate begins to fall. All right. So as we change our way of living, as we can provide more food, for example, the crude death rate falls, but the birth rate hasn't fallen so much. It's still high. And therefore, more people are born than die. And so population begins to rise during stage 2 of the health transition. Socioeconomic development, we give it 2 pluses, and life expectancy at birth begins to rise to be about 30 to 50. The decline in the death rate in Europe, which is the first place on the planet where this began to happen, was in the late 18th century in Northwestern Europe and spread over the next 100 years to the south, and east. So this is a very recent thing that is happening to our species. And the decline in death rate is due initially to 2 factors. All of this is in your reading, but I'm trying to frame it for you. First, improvements in food supply, as agricultural practices were improved in the 18th century, as people learned to rotate crops, as they began to selectively breed food crops, seed technology, and so on. And another food-related factor was the introduction of the potato and corn from the Americas. So our discovery of these old world plants new world plants brought to the old world had this astonishing impact on the survival of European peoples. These new crops increased the quantity of foodstuffs in the European diet, especially in Northern Europe. Second, in addition to improvements in the food supply, there were significant improvements in public health that began to reduce mortality, particularly in childhood. And these are not so much medical breakthroughs as improvements in things like water supply and sewage and food handling. There's actually been arguments that the invention of cotton underwear actually added more life expectancy almost than anything else that we have done. There was a growth in personal hygiene from growing scientific knowledge regarding the causes of disease, and also increasing female literacy, the fact that men and women began to be seen as more equal, and we began to educate girls in rates that approximated the rates of boys, also is felt to have played a role in this declining death rate. So as a result of these things, a consequence of the decline in mortality is increasing population growth and the population explosion that resulted from that. And this growth was not due to an increase in fertility, but rather to a decline in deaths. So this is the second phase of the demographic or the health transition, and it resulted as well in a change in the age structure of the population. In stage 1, the majority of death is concentrated in the first 5 to 10 years of life. Therefore, more than anything else, the decline in death rates in stage 2 entails the increasing survival of children, and hence the population can also become increasingly youthful. Not only is the life expectancy at birth expanding, but the number of young people in the population can be rising. Well, then what happens? Then the birth rates begin to follow the decline in death rates. Now we see I'm looking here to my left. Now we see the blue line, the birth rates begin to decline after the death rates begin to decline. And there are several structural factors that contribute to this decline, some of which remain very speculative, and we don't fully understand this. One of the things that's thought to have happened is that in rural areas, people saw that their children began to live longer, and they voluntarily began to reduce their fertility. They didn't need to have 10 children anymore in order for 2 to survive in childhood. They could just have 5 children because most of them would survive. And increasing urbanization changed traditional values that had been placed on fertility, and urban living also raised the cost of dependent children. So people began to have fewer children. And as I said, female literacy may also have played an important role. Contraceptive technology didn't really play a role until in the second half of the 20th century. So this is called stage 3 of the health transition, the mature industrial stage. Life expectancy at birth has gone up a little bit more to 50 to 55, and now people begin to die primarily of chronic diseases. Now what happens is in stage 4, the post-industrial phase, and countries in Africa, for example, have gone through this health transition just in the latter part of the 20th century. So remember, this all begins in Europe about 200 years ago. The birth rates and the death rates match, but they're now both low. And the population level is now steady and high. This is called the low stationary phase of the health transition. People are now, we have a lot of socioeconomic development. Life expectancy at birth has come to be what you guys expect. It's above 70. And most of the diseases, or we now see a preponderance, or most of the diseases, but we see a kind of rise in mental illness as a prominent feature of the burden of disease in these populations. So I seriously doubt that there will be a 5th stage, but we'll return to this at the end of the course, the kind of age of immortality. Though, as we'll see, some people speculate that we'll have human-machine hybrids at some future time, or that we will somehow be able to use nanotechnology or genetic engineering to make people be immortal or live hundreds of years, some super long period of time. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the class. The 4th stage does involve some delay in disease as well, and certain other features, including the increase in mental illness, and also a phenomenon known as medicalization that I'll come back to in a moment. Okay, so that's a lot of time spent on this, but it's important because I'm trying to frame for you the long arc, the long sweep of what's been happening to us and our species. And this idea of a health transition is a very fundamental and important concept in epidemiology and in the socio-medical sciences. In summary, as socioeconomic development proceeds, mortality and fertility rates shift from high to low rates, populations get larger and older, and the disease pattern shifts from one dominated by infectious diseases, perinatal diseases, and nutritional disorders to one dominated by chronic diseases and mental disorders. Are there any questions about this? Maggie, if you'll help me manage the questions because I can't.
Yeah, so Severin, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. He raised his hand.
You can either call on people or have them or read their questions, whatever they say. So yeah, so whoever raises hand, ask your question.
Yeah, Severin is exactly how you pronounce it. Thank you. I was wondering what leads to the higher CDR in stage 4? Is that like pollution or like what causes the uptick?
Yeah, you're drawing attention to this?
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be some of those things, diseases of industrialization. That's exactly right. That's a subtlety I wasn't going to get into just yet, but that's right. And it's not always seen. Any other questions? Thank you, Severin. Yes, someone else, I think, Maggie, call on them.
Irene, go ahead.
Yeah,
so, okay. So there are countries with like the population decreasing. Could that like possibly be a stage 5? I know like there are a lot of like developed like Asian countries like Japan and South Korea where the population is just like declining.
Yeah, the population is declining because fertility is changing, not increasing death rates, for example, nor but what's happening is the crude birth rate is declining. Hold on one second. So the blue line here is going down even more. Oops. And as a result, the population is declining. That's right. But I wouldn't call that stage 5. But yes, that's a good point. Did I answer your question, Irene, or address it?
Yeah.
Okay. So this increasing life expectancy in the United States is mirrored by a changing composition of causes of death. So it's not only that we're living longer, we're dying of different sorts of things. For example, cancer has been increasing. Cancer is in the dark blue here. This is the dark blue. Here's cancer. Here's the dark blue. You can see on the x-axis is time. On the y-axis is the percent. This is fixed to 100% of death. So what's the relative proportion of causes of death? And influenza in light blue. Here are influenza in light blue. Do you see them here? Oh, look, they were all gone. Isn't that just great? Not like a leading killer, Well, if I could plot what's happening now, they'd be back in spades because of the coronavirus epidemic. So people are living longer and they're dying of different things. But the question is, are we the better for it? And this is an important question we haven't considered yet. Because if I told you that you could live to be 70 and then die, or live to be 70 and then spend 5 years in a coma or in agony and then die at 75, which would you prefer? So let's have a raise of hands. Who would like to live to be 70 and then die? That's option A. And I'm going to ask in a minute who would instead like to live to be 70 and then spend 5 years in agony and then die. We have any takers on the latter?
It was a little unclear, but everyone who's raised their hand so far, I think, was for the first.
For the first one. Very few people would prefer option B. Okay, so it's not just you see a question of how long you live or a question of what you die of. It's a question of what is your health state during the various periods of your life. So we have to ask, are we living better when we live longer? And in fact, this is covered in a classic paper in 1980 that was in your readings. That paper is now 40 years old, and it outlined 3 possibilities. So one possibility, this shows the compression of morbidity and the relationship of morbidity and mortality changes. So one possibility, let's call that present morbidity, is that you live to be 55 and then something happens to you. You have a stroke or you get diabetes or you have some kind of health problem. And then your health gets worse and worse. This little gray line is meant to indicate your health state. And then you die at age 76. One thing we might do as a society is extend your life. So you still get your illness at 55, but now you live an extra 4 years in this lousy state. That's possible. A different possibility is that we shift everything to the right. So the onset of morbidity occurs 5 years later from 55 to 60, and you live 5 years longer from 76 to 81. Clearly, this would be better than that, right? You have extra life, same total duration of morbidity. That's called the shift to the right. But probably the best thing would be a compression of morbidity, where we shift the onset of morbidity to later and also get some life extension. So you're living longer, but you're spending less time in a low health state, less time suffering from some kind of illness that might be harming you. You see, it's not just how long you live or what you die of, it's what your health conditions are while you're alive that is also an important feature of the health transition and of our analysis of these problems. Now, the compression of morbidity is a good thing in and of itself, but it also has policy benefits because it offsets the effects of population aging and offsets the consequences of having an increasing number of elderly people who need medical care. If people were all living longer and in really lousy shape, and we as a society had to spend tons of money on them, that wouldn't be as good as if we could improve the quality of their lives while also improving the quantity of their lives. And a clue that this has actually happened over the last few decades is that life expectancy and the number of elderly in our society have greatly increased, but the number of people in nursing homes has remained constant or declined. This is indirect evidence of the compression hypothesis. Now, when Fries first suggested this idea in 1980, that there could be or would be a compression of morbidity, it was far from clear that there would be, and data to test this idea at a population level were very limited. But since then, we do have data, such as the graph showing estimates based on something known as the National Long-Term Care Survey taken from your readings. This graph shows the year on the y-axis, on the x-axis, and the percent of people disabled on the x-axis. And we can see that the fraction of people who are disabled is dropping dramatically over the last 20 years at about 2% per year. And that this is happening and that this decline in disability is greater than the decline in mortality, which is falling at about 1% a year. So life expectancy is going up because deaths are going down, but disability is going down even more rapidly than mortality is going down, exactly as you would expect in the compression of morbidity hypothesis. So in fact, we are living longer, we are dying of different things, and we are healthier while we live. All three of those things are happening. Now, when we speak of disability, morbidity, and health, we seem to assume that we all mean the same thing and that we know what we mean. But even this seemingly simple thing of defining health is not so simple, because there are in fact many different ways of defining health. One way to define health is just to say it's the absence of disease. But this standard would rely on the failure to detect a disease, and it's a negative definition that relies on instruments to detect pathology, and that also simply shifts the problem to defining diseases. How do we define diseases? It then becomes the challenge if we're saying health is the absence of disease. Another way, however, is the statistical standard, which compares people to the population. So this is one of several important ways that we're going to review today, and that are important concepts for much of the rest of the course, of defining health, the so-called statistical standard. This standard states that diseases of living organisms are internal states which interfere with normal functioning of those organisms. What is to be considered normal functioning is calculated statistically with respect to an age group of a sex of a species. So the idea is there's some distribution in some trait, and then we say, if you're above this line, you're well. If you're below this line, we're going to call you sick. So by this definition, missing a kidney at birth, and in a class this size, probably one or two of you only have one kidney, missing a kidney at birth, which is relatively harmless, or being colorblind, and maybe 5% of the men in this class are colorblind in some way, which is also harmless, relatively harmless, are disease states, right? So if you're colorblind, or if you're missing a kidney and you use this statistical standard, you're going to say that's not normal, therefore that's not healthy. We're going to define those people as being unhealthy. Another standard of defining health is the adaptation standard. And that standard says the states of health or diseases are the expressions of the success or failure experienced by the organism in its efforts to respond adaptively to environmental challenges. The adaptation standard compares people not to each other, but to their surroundings. It stresses the performance of the organism in its physical, biological, and social environment. And it focuses on the ability of an organism to perform given its situational background or standard circumstances. So this sunburned man, who also appears to be deprived of some IQ points and to have done this deliberately, is a poor fit with his high sun environment. Maybe he should kill one of his older siblings, for example, and that might improve his predicament, as we saw last time. More to the point, missing a kidney would not be maladaptive or reflective of ill health in this definition, because you can have a completely normal life with one kidney. In other words, the standard circumstances can vary across time and place and from society to society. And as a result, a person with a particular physical or mental constitution may be able to fit in one environment and not in another, and so may be judged unhealthy in one place, but not unhealthy in another place. In this way, disability can be seen as a failure of adaptation. If your hip, if your grandmother's hip is decrepit and I replace it, she is no longer disabled. But what if I give you a motorized wheelchair? Would you say that an elderly person with a hip that doesn't work, that uses a wheelchair, is healthy or unhealthy? Why would that be different than replacing their hip with a device inside their body compared to a device outside their body? Would we say that a person whose hips don't work, who's given a wheelchair, let's say you're born and from birth you can't walk, you might have had spina bifida and you're paralyzed from the waist down, If I give you a motorized wheelchair, we might say you're perfectly healthy. That's a different definition than the definition in the previous page. Or, and some of you in this class may have cochlear implants, I don't know, if you're born deaf, are you unhealthy? And if we give you a hearing aid, are you then healthy? To what extent do these technological fixes fundamentally change the nature, not only of the experience of the person, but how we perceive them? Now, this you can get quite serious about the sunburn example if you want. Here's what happens when you take a fair-skinned set of people and move them to an environment on the equator. This slide shows the incidence of melanoma in countries around the world. Now, melanoma is, if not caught early, is a very deadly type of skin cancer. It's really, when I was used to take care of patients as a hospice doctor, taking patients with terminal melanoma is really awful. And and you should all be very vigilant about watching melanoma. Of course, it afflicts fair-skinned people more than dark-skinned people, but dark-skinned people can get melanoma as well, and so it shouldn't be taken lightly. Anyway, Australia and New Zealand have the highest rates in the world by far of this deadly disease. So this is incidence per 100,000. Greece, so if you're Mediterranean, you have very low level of melanoma, but here in Australia and New Zealand, you have very high levels. This is incidence of malignant melanoma in males in the year 2000. But the Aboriginal peoples of New Zealand and Australia do not suffer from melanoma. They are adapted to their environment. And in fact, it's not just physical aspects of the environment, such as the sunlight, that matters. Biological aspects can also be relevant to your fit with the environment in this adaptation standard. Historically, for example, Native Americans were just fine in terms of some aspects of their health for centuries until their environment suddenly changed with the introduction of Europeans and their old world infections. Because after the Europeans settled the New World, the native populations were wiped out, were decimated because of the introductions of new pathogens into their environment. Epidemics of pathogens such as smallpox and measles raged through the population and annihilated them. Here is one estimate on the left of the population decline in the population of Native Americans in Mexico from 1518 to 1593. There is an over 90% decline in less than 100 years. In 1518, there are 25 million people, and by 1593, only 2 million are left. It's a catastrophe, right? A pandemic disease that just utterly annihilates these populations. And in the course of writing my book, Apollo's Arrow, which you'll read later in the semester, I include many first-person accounts of Native Americans alive during that time, describing what it was like to see everyone around them die suddenly after no problems for a very long time. Much of these was attributed to infection, but of course there were other changes that led to this mortality. And here's another example on the right. This graph estimates the population decline of the Illinois Indians from 1677 to 1765, in other words, a century later, and there's an over 70% decline here also in less than 100 years, again, largely due to infection. In fact, this level of mortality was so high that it introduced Darwinian selection effects in these populations. The selection effects of these epidemics were so large that genetic analyses today reveal population bottlenecks. One recent study from 2016 of the Tsimshian people of Canada revealed that a population crash in the 19th century led to clear, discernible shifts in immune-related genes. Only those people, only those members of that society that happen to have genetic variation equipping them with certain kinds of immune functions were able to survive the arrival of the Europeans. Based on this genetic study, at least 57% of the population was wiped out, and we can use the genetics to time it 175 years ago. And in fact, amazingly, this number triangulates with historical accounts and first-person accounts of this population, of these Native Americans, that suggested that 70% of their population perished due to smallpox about 175 years ago. And this is a 500-year-old drawing that depicts the Nahua Native Americans suffering from smallpox. They knew what was happening to them and provided testimony in the form of oral histories and visual images. They died. Smallpox was very uniformly fatal. Now, a third way of defining health is that in some ways, disease does not exist until we have agreed that it does by perceiving, naming, and responding to it. This is the so-called social value standard that compares people to ideals and ideas. How can a disease exist, in fact, until we humans detect, define, and name it? For example, prior to the antibiotic era, having the sequelae of infections, such as pockmarked skin, was normal and was not deemed to reflect a disease process at all. Or, for example, hypertension, nobody knew about high blood pressure until we invented the sphygmomanometer, the blood pressure cuff that could measure your blood pressure. And once we had this device, all of a sudden we created a new disease called high blood pressure. So missing a kidney or color blindness are only diseases if we say so. And in fact, there are many so-called culture-bound syndromes. Culture-bound syndromes comprise several kinds of illness or affliction, all of which are defined as culture-bound in that they do not have a one-to-one correspondence with a disorder recognized by Western allopathic nosologies. Nosologies are taxonomies of diseases. And these culture-bound syndromes often have obscure biological origins. And in fact, they are initially reported as confined to a particular culture or a set of related or geographically proximal cultures. Now, these diseases pose somewhat greater conceptual problems when we're thinking deeply about health. For example, in Latin America, there's a disease called susto. Some of you may have even heard of this disease, depending on where your grandparents have come from. It's an illness attributed to a frightening event that causes the soul to leave the body, leading to symptoms of unhappiness and sickness. People from these cultures have a disease condition that they define as susto and that they experience, but which we in Western medicine might have difficulty identifying a biological cause. Or there's a disease that's common in Malaysia and certain nearby regions in Asia known as koro. This is a sudden episode of intense anxiety that the penis, or in rare female cases, the vulva and nipples, will recede into the body and possibly result in the patient dying. And this syndrome actually sometimes occurs in local epidemics. You have outbreaks of koro where all the men suddenly are worried that their penis is going to disappear. And it goes by many different names in certain Asian societies, like Suo Yang in China. And there have been isolated cases in the United States and Europe. And the treatment for this condition consists of assigning a trusted family member to hold the penis 24 hours a day to prevent it from being pulled up into the patient's body. There are also other examples. For example, a telling historical example was that in our country, in the middle of the 19th century, there was a Dr. Samuel Cartwright in Louisiana who was a member of the LA Medical Association, and he defined the condition known as drapetomania, which comes from the Greek word of escape, and this was the insatiable desire of slaves to escape. He thought this was a disease and gave it a name and labeled it as such. So the point is, with these examples, is that we can define what diseases might be. And there are many modern examples. We can look at these, strange cultures and historical periods and think, oh, well, that was then, or that is them, not us, but that's not true. For example, back pain in the West is maybe in many cases a culture-bound syndrome. It's a disease that often afflicts middle-aged men, and there are no signs of it. You can't do any tests in many cases. And when they get it, they're not supposed to work. They're supposed to stay home and stay in bed, for example. So, other cultures might look at this, like cultures in Amazonia might say, wait a minute, your middle-aged men sometimes get this crazy condition known as back pain, which relieves them of all these obligations. We define it. And in fact, some clues to its culture boundedness are that there are widely varying rates of back pain, and the biological origins are very obscure. After the reunification of Germany, the rates of back pain in middle-aged men among people from Eastern Europe suddenly rose and matched the rates of back pain among West Germans on the other side of the Berlin Wall. Some people have suggested that anorexia, which is the severe restriction of food intake associated with a morbid fear of obesity, and that sometimes is associated with other methods that the patient uses to lose weight, including excessive exercise, is a culture-bound syndrome. This afflicts especially relatively well-to-do women. It afflicts white women more than Black women in rich countries. And in many poor countries around the world, if you went and told them that we had a disease called anorexia, they would think this is nuts. How can you have such a condition? So all of these examples are one of the things we mean when we say that a disease is socially constructed. This is a very deep and important idea with an old history in philosophy and in sociology. And we're going to come back to this idea when we read Emily Martin's magnificent book, The Woman in the Body, in a couple of lectures. So to recap, we've considered 4 possible types of definitions of disease, of health. The first is the absence of disease, which defines health by reference to its opposite. The second is the statistical standard, which compares people to the population of their peers. The third is the adaptation standard, which compares people to their environment. And the fourth is the social standard, which compares people to ideals and ideas. And in fact, there's one more official definition, the WHO definition of health, which is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And in fact, there are still other definitions, health as happiness, or the so-called welfare theory of health. And the definition we choose is important because it implies obligations on patients, doctors, and society. Is health a personal or a communal good? And how can it be measured? And this connection of health to happiness and overall well-being is important for both conceptual and methodological reasons, in part because it's related to the concept of utility. Now, utility refers to the happiness or satisfaction gained consuming goods and services, or from being in a certain state. People are construed as rationally trying to maximize their utility and rationally trying to be as well off as possible. This idea of utility is supposed to be a summary measure of everything we care about. It's thus an expression of our values. And measuring utility and happiness and health are complicated and tricky. Many social scientists take a behaviorist view of utility. They say it is a hypothetical construct that accounts for the observed choices that individuals make. And in a bit of reasoning that borders on tautology, they sometimes argue that people are rational maximizers of their own utility. And so by definition, whatever people do necessarily maximizes their utility. This is the traditional economic perspective. But I don't take that view. Rather, I leave open the possibility that choices do not maximize utility very well at all. I think that judgments are at least as relevant as decisions and actions when we think about utility. Let me explain this a little bit by some examples and some measurements with the time that I have. So how do we measure utility or health more generally? Proper research and understanding trends in disability and health and in quality of life requires a specification of what we mean and also how to measure it. So when we're talking about health, we need to be specific. What are we talking about? Are we talking about death in the form of infant mortality rates, IMR, or life expectancy? Are we talking about physical measures or disability that we discussed earlier, measured in different sorts of ways? Are we talking about self-reports? Are we talking about symptoms? Do you have pain or depression? Or we can use vignettes and describe different conditions to you and ask you what you think of them. Or we can use 3 quantitative ways that I'd like to introduce to you now, known as the standard gamble, the time trade-off, or so-called visual analog scales. And what procedure we adopt for measuring health is crucial because it defines what matters. You know, is it objective or subjective measures? What if there's inconsistency between the objective and subjective measures? Should we privilege people's own perspectives or some more objective biological measures? Should we use the social or statistical standards? Why should we care? And also, this is a question of whose values matter. Do we derive assessments of health states from people who have them or from people who do not? From the young or from the old? From the rich or from the poor? And it turns out it can matter quite a bit. Consider whether we want to know how bad is it if you have to walk with a cane. Let's say we want to say, well, how bad is it to walk with a cane? Assessing how bad is it depends on whether we ask young people or old people. If you ask an 80-year-old, how bad is it to walk with a cane? That person would say, that's not bad at all. I'm happy I'm alive. I can walk just fine with a cane. All my friends use canes. So the relative standard, it's normative in my society for elderly people to use canes. There's nothing unhealthy about using a cane at all. But if you asked a 20-year-old what it would be, that person might give a different definition about the walking with a cane state. So let's look at how we measure utility or health more generally, because proper research and understanding trends in disability and health and in the quality of life requires a specification of this. So it turns out that the way scientists do this is by sophisticated measures of the would you rather game, which is a parlor game that I suspect many of you recognize and you may have played in high school. Would you rather have sex with Bert and Ernie? Perhaps some of you argued about in high school, or be eaten by ants or by lions, or be able to fly or read others' thoughts. Raise your hands if you remember playing these games when you were in elementary school or middle school. Yeah, so you can raise your hands virtually. Yeah, this is a very common game. Would you rather drool frequently and uncontrollably, or be a bedwetter, or have to always eat standing up, or always enter your car from the passenger door, or hate your life but be popular, or love your life but be despised? So there's the way scientists measure health states, believe it or not, is a variant of some of these games. So for example, we might say, there's a website you can go to if you want to play such games. And I could ask you, would you rather live in a world where there are no problems or live in a world where you rule? You can go to this website, the Would You Rather website, and play which of these two you would want. I'll let you decide which of these two worlds you would rather live in. Or you could ask yourself another question. Would you rather be the smartest person or the hottest person? You could, and maybe some of you would have different thoughts about this question. Well, it turns out that with that preamble, there's a way you can measure utility known as the standard gamble. Let's say you want to measure the intrinsic healthiness of state A. So here is health state A. And here, down here is, and you want to measure it. And then alternative is this branch. So here's choice A, which leads to health state A, or choice B, which leads to a gamble, okay? And we could give people a choice. Would you rather choose to be in this health state, or would you rather choose to go to this gamble, where with probability P, you will have perfect health, which is assumed to have a utility of 1, or probability 1 minus P, be immediately put to death, which is assumed to have utility 0. And so now what we do is then we vary this probability P from 1% to 2% to 5% to 10%, and we ask people, which choice would you rather make? Would you rather take choice A or choice B? And we do that until we reach equilibrium where they have no preference between the two. For example, we say health state A might be having no legs. Now, would you choose to have no legs, or would instead you choose to have perfect health with probability 90% or a 10% chance of dying? So I might ask you, which would you rather do? Face a 10% immediate chance of death, or otherwise have perfect health, or live the rest of your life with no legs. Okay? And then I measure that probability until I find that people are indifferent between the two. And then I use this formula, this probability P times 1 plus 1 minus P times 0, which disappears because of the zero term, the utility 0. And then I can conclude that the utility of health, the utility of this state H, of this health state, is equal to the probability P, right? So when the people are indifferent to the choice A and choice B, they can go in either direction. The value of this utility must be equal to the value of this state. And this state's utility is computed by this formula. Therefore, I can compute the utility of health state A by varying the probability until we get to an indifference point. Yes, there's a question, David.
Hi there, and thanks, Maggie. Just wanted to confirm something, that the question mark here, it's like less of a question mark, it's more of like a blank space where you put in what you're referring to.
Yes, I'm sorry. So
Okay.
the utility of this health state is unknown, and we're trying to compute it. What's the utility of this health state, for example? And so this is one technique for doing that. Another technique is called the time trade-off method, which looks at time on the x-axis, and imagine that health status is on the y-axis, and basically asks people. So here is, you can be in a perfect health, which is set to 1 until time t1, let's say for 10 years, or you can be in some lower state of health, let's say lacking legs, and be in that state for some longer period of time. And then by varying this time, so we say, okay, I give you guys the choice. You can live for another 10 years in perfect health, or you can live without an eye, which about 2% of people are blind in one eye, for some longer period of time. Okay? So and it would have to be longer, because if it were shorter, if you could be in a worse health state and live less long, nobody would pick that choice, right? So the point is, the worst health state is some longer period of time. And then now I assess, well, how much longer do you have to live to compensate for being in this worst health state? And then I can use this formula here and compute the utility of this second health state as the difference between these quantities. Where T is here. So right now, let's say you're 40 years old, capital T, and I look at 50 years old minus, or let's say you're 20 years old for your age group. You're 20 years old, you could live to be 30. So you do T1, 30 minus 20 times 1, that's this utility, is equal to T2. Let's say you want to live to be 40 years old with one eye. 40 minus 20 is 20. And then you compute, then you solve for the utility of health state H. It's T1 minus T over T2 minus T. And that gives you the health state of this in this technique. I'm going to keep going and allow time for questions at the end. So it works like this. You tell people you're aged 50, you have severe arthritis, you're unable to walk, you're in constant pain, and you must choose between living with arthritis until age 80 or living in perfect health for a shorter length of time. And you ping pong until the amount of time chosen neutralizes the difference. And if people say, oh, they would live to age 75, you plug in the numbers like I just said, and you compute that the utility of severe arthritis, being unable to walk, in constant pain, is 0.83. And this is a way that you could use the time trade-off method. Or you could do something much simpler, which is to use visual analog scales. This is very easy. You just show people a line and you say health states can vary between 0 and 10. Let me describe a health state to you. Put an X where you think that health state is. How bad is serious arthritis and chronic pain? And they might put an X, like right there. Or how bad is it being paralyzed from the neck down? And they might put an X over here at 3, for example. And that's how, then you measure the millimeters in a sample of people do this. You take an average and you measure the distance, and that's how you assign the utility. And here's some illustrative utilities that have been obtained by using these measures. How bad is it to be in different health states? Perfect health is said to be 1, mild angina, which is having chest pain because your heart, your coronary arteries are blocked, has a health utility of 0.9. A kidney transplant, 0.84. Many of you probably have relatives who have had kidney transplants. There's some, it can be difficult to have had a kidney transplant. You have to take certain medicines, you have certain limitations. Severe arthritis, being on dialysis for the rest of your life. That's seen as being pretty bad, but not as bad as being seriously depressed or blind. Being blind is seen as a health utility of 0.39, or deaf, or permanently hospitalized, or dead, okay? Now note that death is considered to be equivalent to 0, but we've already established that some health states, as we talked about earlier, like being in agony, could be considered worse than death. And people have begun to think about assigning them negative utilities, like being bedbound and in severe pain, or being in something known as a persistent vegetative state. Well, let's look at the way that utilities or health measures, in fact, might be used. The reason this is important is because it provides us another way to understand what's happening with health and the compression of morbidity hypothesis that we discussed at the beginning of this lecture. Imagine on the x-axis that we have health or utility, I'm sorry, on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have time. And we look at 2 different people. And at every moment in time, we define what is their utility or health. So here is patient 2, who's doing in great health. Maybe then they have a stroke, and then their health is okay. Then they have another stroke, which is awful, and they're in really bad health, but then we treat them a little bit, and so they get better, and then they're like this, and then maybe they get in a car accident, and so now they're paralyzed, and they're doing a little bit better, worse, and then they do badly, and then they come over here, and then they die. And we compare that to patient 1, who starts in the same place and have some decrement here and some decrement here, and then they die here. If we just compare the death time between the 2 people, and we look at the life years gained between the 2, we might form a misimpression of what's actually going on. We might want to integrate the area under the 2 curves and add up all the quality adjusted life years, the so-called QALYs, across all these 2 individuals. And by that metric, even though patient 1 did live longer, it's not just about the fact that patient 1 lived longer. They had a better quality of life at every single moment. Their total quality adjusted life years was much more. A QALY places a weight on time in different health states, and a year of perfect health is worth 1. However, a year of less than perfect health is worth less than 1. And QALYs provide a common currency to assess the extent of benefits gained from a variety of interventions in terms of health-related quality of life. Okay, I'm almost done, and then we'll have a minute or 2 for questions. Because all of the foregoing, however, are what we might call thin measures of health. This borrows the famous expression by anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who talked about thick description of the world. Here's what a thick description of health state might be from some of medical anthropologist Arthur Kleinman's work. This is Alice Alcott, a 46-year-old patient with lifelong diabetes and a new onset heart disease and angina. She's talking about her health. How was I going to live with this limitation? What a burden I would be on my family and friends. I feared becoming the town invalid. I was terribly guilty. I had felt all along that my illness had interfered with my relationship to my children. I never had enough time to give them. I was more preoccupied with myself than with their problems. I was in the hospital at critical times for them. Now I would be nothing but a burden. As far as my husband goes, the guilt was worse. After the chest pain, I feared having sexual relations with him. We became celibate. The claudication, that's pain in your legs because of poor circulation. The angina, that's pain in your heart because of poor circulation. They interfered with the things we loved: long walks in the country, birding, climbing, sports. I had become self-centered in order to control my condition. I felt like a survivor. All I was good for was hanging on. Note also how much this person values the way her health is affecting others. Just like the suicide cases we considered at the beginning of last lecture, where people killing themselves thought about how they were interacting with other people. This type of description highlights a very good question. It isn't to this that doctors should orient themselves. Rather, taking care of this sort of suffering, rather than somehow orienting themselves to adjusting the quality adjusted life years, is what's really important. In other words, what I would argue is that to be a good doctor, what you have to do is think about health this way, not with the standard gamble and time trade-off and utility and all the other stuff that I just introduced you to. And finally, a final aspect that I would like to note about the status of health in the modern era is that of medicalization. This is another important idea. And this process, this idea of medicalization, involves increasingly seeing doctors as for progressively less serious conditions. So medicalization is a feature of modernity, and those aspects of medicalization are that we increasingly see doctors for more and more minor things, or seeing doctors for non-medical conditions, or the redefinition of such conditions to be under the purview of doctors, or seeing doctors for normal parts of life experience. Many, if not the majority of outpatient visits to doctors in the United States today do not result in any specific diagnosis being made. Something like 50% of the time people go to an emergency room, they leave without the doctor being able to tell them what's wrong with them, let alone a serious illness being detected. People may be healthier by all the measures that we've been considering and may not feel so good with others. Here's a list of some conditions that have recently been medicalized. We understand all of these conditions increasingly in medical terms, whereas formerly we may have understood them as non-medical problems. Premenstrual syndrome, for example, ADHD symptoms in children. Maybe 100 years ago, if you had ADHD symptoms, we didn't think of that as an illness. We didn't give you medication for that. Erectile dysfunction, baldness, short stature, acne, infertility, child abuse, substance use, road rage is seen as a medical problem. Gambling is seen as a medical problem. Poverty or gun violence, or as we'll see, even climate change is increasingly seen as a medical problem. Formerly, these kinds of things may have been seen and understood as different kinds of deviance, as problems of law and crime, or religion and sin and moral failing, or medicine and illness. And some of them, in fact, may actually be culture-bound syndromes. Or the medicalization, if we really want to see it in its broadest sense, what medicalization is the progressive annexation of not illness into illness. As my advisor, Sociology Renee Fox, has put it in her terrific essay on this topic, health and illness have come to symbolize many positively and negatively valued biological, physical, social, cultural, and even metaphysical phenomena. Increasingly, health is coming to be seen as a coded way of referring to any ideal state of affairs. These medicalized conditions are also a part of the health transition. It may even be the case that as mortality has declined over the last 100 years, and as doctors have, in some sense, had less to do, there has been a compensating rise in medicalization because we still see ourselves as needing doctors. Okay, I think we're finished. Are there any question or two real quickly before I say goodbye? Yes?
I have a question. So I was wondering about, you'd kind of got into this towards the end, but about the sort of thin measures of health,
Yes.
like the standard gamble, time trade-off, et cetera. I just wondered too about the value of that, not even just in contrast with like the thick measure, but also in the sense of like how, like, you kind of mentioned this with like a young person thinking having a cane is like a really bad thing. Like, how much can a person really say like how bad something would be if they haven't really experienced it. Like, because I think especially with like blindness or deafness, like that sounds really bad to me right now, but I think for if you were to like talk to a blind or deaf person, I think they would give a different response. Like I think you kind of adapt to your situation, sort of regardless of what your actual health is. And so like I think that could have like a pretty big impact. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, hold on, I need to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. I don't know, stop share, there we go. Yes, I'm actually going to return exactly to that question later on. And I'm going to tell some stories of people who are blind or who have other health states who feel very differently about those things, just like the cane example. So who we elicit those things from affects how we measure those things. And in turn, that illustrates a little bit of the adaptation and social standards we discussed today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to build in more time. 'cause
Nicholas,
this-
there's one more question.
Okay, I'm going to build in more time for questions into lecture time so we don't go over, partly because this medium is very difficult since I can't see you and it's hard to read the audience. I'll answer this question, but I'm going to do better because we'll build in time for questions. Yes, last question.
All right, so the question is whether or not the time trade-off model is effective for progressive diseases such as dementia or less.
Yes, you can ask people, you can do that. You can describe any state you want, like you suddenly become demented or you become demented over some period of time, and then ask people to do the time trade-off method. And so you can use the method for that as well. Thank you all. See you on Tuesday, and we'll keep sectioning and we'll keep addressing some of these issues, the technical issues. Thank you so much.